Let's get some perspective now from our powerhouse legal team. We have trial attorney Monique Pressley, who used to represent Bill Cosby, Jim Trusty, former chief of the DOJ's organized crime and gang section. He used to represent President Donald Trump, and Shan Wu, defense attorney and former federal prosecutor. Great to be with all of you. First to you, Shan. So Mia has been questioned for 3 days now, virtually the same amount of time that we saw Cassie Ventura on the stand for. What impact do you think she's going to have on the outcome of this trial?
Well, I think the reason you're seeing her up there for such a long time is because it shows what kind of impact she could potentially have on it. Like Ventura, she's also being presented as a witness who was also victimized here. And so that's a very important piece of foundation for the prosecution to lay. They still have a lot of stuff to tie together, but they have to get this evidence out there. And I think from the sounds of it, it's been awfully compelling testimony.
Compelling testimony that does overlap with some of the allegations of physical and sexual abuse that we've heard previously. Is there a risk that the prosecution is overlapping too much?
There's a risk in cases like this where the prosecution really has to be careful that the more impactful, even salacious testimony doesn't go past the point of being probative versus prejudice, which can solve a lot of problems for you on appeal if you get the conviction. Little hard to say. I mean, you're seeing objections from both sides a lot today. I think today's objections were more the prosecution was trying to make a point to the jury that the defense was kind of being bullying towards the victim. But they do have to be careful with that, and they have to really stay in the focus zone of making sure all this very impactful, compelling evidence gets tied to the elements of the charges.
Can I say something about those objections?
Please.
You know, it's a bit of trial advocacy, I suppose. Yeah, it is a difficult spot in front of a jury to have somebody on the other side who you feel is drawing you into constant objections. Because in a sense, if you keep objecting, you're highlighting that they're scoring points. Sometimes the jury takes it the opposite way, like you're obstructing a logical course of questioning. So it's a real art to figure out, when do I just sit down and let it play out? When do I not? What I'm hearing from the report is that the judge is not being a particular activist about shutting down the defense cross. If that's the case, you got to read the room as a prosecutor and wait for just a few times where it's really critical to object. So I think that's an interesting kind of game within the game that's going on. The other thing I just want to mention real quick, you know, assault and sexual assault are not predicate crimes for RICO. This is charged as a racketeering, influence, corrupt organization, the entity being all of Sean Combs's businesses and himself. So it's legally permissible, but kind of factually tricky. I think what this is building to, believe it or not, is a witness that's not a victim. It's building towards an expert on human trafficking and sex trafficking to explain why someone like Mia would stick around, why Mia would still have this misplaced allegiance years later. And they're going to put it in the context of the psychological control that happens in human trafficking cases. So I think that's going to be a real interesting battle down the road, is who comes in to tie these crimes together that are not actual RICO predicates, but will come together as a human trafficking or sexual trafficking predicate.
The forced aspect of violence does go to the forced sex trafficking too, so they kind of have that outlet.
Right, but not the assault, not the rape per se. It's got to be, you know, part of the bigger picture.
Monique,
and the sex trafficking depends on whom the victim is actually supposed to be for the sex trafficking. They spent the first few weeks of this case saying that it was Miss Ventura, when to me that was always kind of obvious that there were others who they could probably get a better case out of. But I agree. Where's the beef is what we're going to need to know. If they're trying to use the expert that you think that they're going to use, I think that's a huge problem, because they're trying to put, again, someone on the stand to explain why people did things that they haven't evaluated, that they who they weren't treating. It's the same thing as the prior expert that they had, who tried to explain why Miss Ventura would do things or not do things when she hadn't spent a day treating her, hadn't done an evaluation of her. That's highly unreliable, and juries are not dumb.
Okay, on that I would disagree with you. I just say on the expert, because I've actually was one of the first prosecutors in D.C. to use a domestic violence expert. As long as the expert isn't opining on the ultimate issue, saying this was, you know, wrong legally, I think it gives you a very good framework as a prosecutor to fit in the behavior of the witnesses and possibly explain this question of why didn't she report earlier.
it's fascinating to see the prosecution and someone with prosecutorial experience take one side and the defense take the other. I wonder what you make of what Jim was describing about the difficulty in pushing a RICO case forward. You have cell phones being stolen, you have cars being tracked, allegations of which Does that not rise to the level of coercion, and does that not get them closer to a RICO case?
Right now, it's all kind of sounding like throw everything against the wall and see how much you can get to stick. It's not coming out like some organized common scheme or plan. It's not sounding, I mean, RICO cases are hard to prove anyway. And when you have a circumstance like this where a jury may very well be looking and thinking the domestic violence is horrible, this is not anybody's great guy. They may detest the defendant, but they may not see that as the same thing as a criminal enterprise. They may think this is a horrible domestic violence relationship and that this is a person who was a cruel boss. And those two things can be true without there being a RICO at the end of the line.
True, but a very challenging closing argument for a defense attorney. It's because you've got, by that point, there may be this critical mass of people being dangled out windows, sexual assaults, obstruction, horrible things. You get to a point, you stand up in closing and you go, yeah, that's kind of all true, but it doesn't add up to a RICO. That's a tough argument. Doesn't mean it's not, it's available for sure. We're going to hear it for sure. But it's a tough fight by that point of the trial for the jury to disconnect.
And it depends on your jury. It depends on how many people they've dangled out of windows, how many times they've been obsessed lovers who are running down the middle of the street trying to keep their wife from leaving.
That's
you have to figure out who you
perspective.
have as a jury in order to know what they're going to be thinking.
You ask questions during jury selection, how many of you have dangled somebody out the window?
And
that one
they
might be
answer
telling.
honestly.
I do wonder what you all make of victim number 3. This is someone that was set to testify. They're not going to testify, even as we've seen other witnesses come forward and make clear that they are only testifying because they're under subpoena. What's going on with victim number 3?
Well, it's hard to speculate what's going on with them. As a prosecutor, I wouldn't be too worried about that if I've portrayed this atmosphere of people being really scared and intimidated, and I just kind of let that speak for itself. And going back to the point about the closing aspect of it too, I think if this trial continues to play out this way, you've got all this really explosive kind of evidence. The job for the prosecutor at the end is to stay pretty dispassionate. Don't rely too much on the emotion. Explain how the charges and the elements are met by this evidence, and don't rely too much on that explosive aspect, because that's where you get into trouble.
Appreciate all of you. Thanks so much for the conversation.
Good to see you.
Still plenty more news to come.